So before we go any further, this particular session is about diversity, and we need to recognize that there are so many different diverse audiences. Diversity includes many different categories, and we are not going to have time to address these individually. We are not going to have time to go into each potential audience and its needs and its culture and ways that we can interact specifically with each audience. We wanted to recognize that, and that we should be aware of the different types of diverse audiences that we deal with, that we address, that we communicate with, that we participate in ourselves. I also wanted to do a quick call out. I've already introduced Sherelle, or asked Sherelle to introduce herself. There are several people at the Lunar and Planetary Institute who helped us to organize this, to plan it, and what the contents were going to be, and our speakers. And so I wanted to give a really quick shout out to Dr. Edgar Rivera-Valentin, to Dr. Kendall Lynch, to Dr. Justin Filiberto, and to Betsaida Aponte Hernandez for all of their help as we planned this. That being said, let's go ahead and move on and introduce our panelists. If you are having any trouble or want to share your thoughts, your ideas, or responses, please do so in the chat box. If you're having trouble hearing, please join us by phone if you're having any issues with the sound. And so we have three panelists with us today. We're going to allow each of them to speak briefly, and then we'll have our open discussion. So our panelists include Dr. Christina Richey. She's at JPL, and she's the program manager for the Planetary Science Research and Analysis, and she also plays a very important role in diversity, equity, inclusion. Dr. Frances Rivera-Hernandez is a planetary geologist at Dartmouth College, although she's about to be moving, become a faculty in Georgia. Dr. David Trang is an assistant researcher at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And so, without further ado, Dr. Christina Richey, we're going to go ahead and give you control of the screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Awesome.
Great. Okay. Hi, I'm Christina Richey. I am the program manager for planetary science RNA at Jeff Propulsion Laboratory. Many of you actually know me for a lot of my diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility work that I have done in both the planetary science and astrophysics communities. And a lot of you know me for being someone who worked with the Hubble Space Telescope, worked with the Space Telescope Science Institute on the dual anonymous working group for both Hubble and James Webb. So I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, why is Christina one of the speakers today when we're talking about cultural diversity? And one of the reasons why I was asked to help today, I'm seeing if I can get it to click. Is it moving forward for you all? I have hit the advance forward button a couple of times now and it hasn't moved.
For me, it took a few tries. I don't know why. It seems to be slower.
Yeah. Sherelle, do you maybe want to just take back control of the screen and I can politely ask you to move forward on each slide? We've only got a couple of slides there, so. Okay, go ahead and, there we go. One of the reasons why I am here is actually to talk a little bit about implicit bias. Implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and actions in an unconscious manner. And it occurs regardless of the dominant group. So when you're looking at gender implicit bias, both men and women downplay women's contributions or non-binary entities' contributions. Likewise, for race, both whites and minorities will downplay minorities' contributions. This leads to a few effects within the STEM community that Jennifer Tessey has given some really great talks on previously, including her winter 2017 OPAG talk. One of those is the Matthew effect, where the most famous name gets all the work attributed to them, and lower status scientists are often overlooked. And the Matilda effect, which is that women in collaborations with men, whether married or unmarried, typically receive less credit, and men profit more from the discoveries, which means they're not the most famous name, which means they get overlooked more because of the Matthew effect. So biases have a large impact on our everyday collaborations within the field. Go ahead and move on to the next slide for me. So one of the things that we want to do is try to mitigate these biases, and we should understand how they impact our daily work efforts. Everything from resumes to jobs to fellowships to hiring, awards, promotions, proposal reviews, but also how we give talks and how we present our research has our own biases within that very scheme. So we want to mitigate our own biases within the way that we present our science to others. There's some techniques that you can really utilize to mitigate bias. One is to use training to mitigate the effects on the process. I really highly recommend the Kerwin Institute's training at The Ohio State University. It's one of my favorite implicit bias trainings that are out there. And then in terms of things like jobs or proposal writing or proposal reviews, journal review submissions, you want to move towards a more dual anonymous review. Space Telescope Science Institute has done this for both Hubble and James Webb. NASA is starting to do this with a bunch of their programs. All of the guest observing programs in astrophysics are utilizing this type of review now. And 4 different ROSES RNA programs across the Science Mission Directorate are using this method. So you want to really mitigate this bias. And as you're doing this mitigation, you want to think about all forms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I want to highlight accessibility here in the next couple of slides. Go ahead and move on to my next slide. So I wanted to note that when you're talking about accessibility, realize that fonts matter, particularly when you're presenting your research, either on slides like we're doing right now, or in a journal article, or in a proposal. Proposals are a big place where you really want to try to make sure you have the most readable document possible, something that flows easy for the reviewers. And when you're thinking of accessibility, you should know your audience. 10% of the world population and 15% of STEM populations have some form of dyslexia. Monospace and sans serif fonts, like Verdana, Arial, Courier for the monospace, are the easiest to read. Serif fonts like Times New Roman and fancy fonts like Chancery are actually the most difficult to read. Italic serif fonts like Times New Roman in italics is all but impossible for someone with certain forms of dyslexia to read. So as you're creating slides or writing proposals or writing journal articles, try to use sans serif fonts whenever possible. And if you have to switch to italics, switch to a sans serif font italic like Calibri. Use different fonts for captures of figures and box your figures in. That's how you can separate them from the rest of the page. And make sure that you're not doing too many tricks on one page. Keep it as simple as possible for the audience to be able to get the information. Can I go to my next slide? My one other tiny note I wanted to give on accessibility is that colors matter too. Folks might be colorblind, and many of us print documents. Say you're writing a proposal, many of us print those in grayscale on black and white printers. So have you really made your figures such that they can be seen in grayscale? Have you made your entire slide easily accessible to folks who are colorblind? There's a lot of great resources out there to help you create slides and proposals and presentations that are colorblind friendly. This is just one of the different websites you can go to find a list of 20 simple distinct colors. Francis is going to be covering more on kind of accessibility of your slides here in a moment. So that's my 5 minutes right there. We're going to go ahead and move on and let Francis go next.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. We appreciate it. And a reminder, folks, you're welcome to post questions and ideas into the chat box as you'd like. So Francis, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, she's muted. Let's go ahead and unmute her.
I did exactly the thing you told me not to do. But here we are. Hi, everybody. As Christine said, I'm Frances Rivera-Hernandez, and I'm a postdoc at Dartmouth College, soon to be an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. And I currently live in Queens, New York, so it's been an exciting couple of weeks here. But I'm originally from Puerto Rico. And many of you may know me from the planetary community or from GeoLatinas. I'm very involved in that on Twitter. And so welcome. Next slide. Do I have control of the slides? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about today is something that's important to me. It's close to so near and dear to my heart. It's on tips for preventing or tips for presenting to non-native English speakers. This is something that I've had to do at all levels, from talking to elementary school children to mission team meetings. We're bound to have an audience of members whose first language is not English. I myself, as you can tell, I'm not a native English speaker, and I have experienced this myself being an audience member. And so these are just some personal tips. And if any of my other panelists has any tips to share, or if any of our participants want to share their own tips, feel free to include those in the chat. So the first one is to speak clearly and enunciate words. There are some American accents in particular where certain consonants are not pronounced in a word. I love diversity and I love the diversity of accents, but it is something to just be mindful of. Second is to pace yourself and take a lot of pauses. I do this frequently in my talks by taking a sip of water. It sort of forces me to just take a break. And I even include that in my notes to myself and presenter view when I'm giving a talk, just to remind myself to do it. Avoid slang and do not use idioms. This is probably the most common mistake that I see not only during talks, but also during normal conversations with non-English speakers. Americans love idioms to the point where, like, again, as a non-English speaker, I can't keep the idioms, like I can't keep track of the idioms, and so I just make up new idioms myself. And nobody understands what I'm saying because I'm just making them up. A common one that scientists love to use is back of the envelope calculations. Another one is thinking outside the box. Words like these, or idioms like these, are exclusionary and they should be avoided. Nobody's gonna know what you're talking about, especially if you're giving a talk abroad, for example, or even at a team meeting. You know, with curiosity, I was doing mission operations today, and a good chunk of our team is French. And so it's just something to think about. Limit the use of contractions. These tend to make it difficult to understand individual words. When using slides, write key points at the top of the slides. Repeat main ideas throughout the talk. And try to include well-labeled figures if you do have figures, so that audience members can still follow your presentation, even if they may not understand everything that you're saying verbally. And then be careful with hand gestures is my last tip. A lot of cultures tend to use a lot of hand gestures, even Puerto Ricans. I'm doing a lot now. But it is something to be mindful of, especially, again, if you're planning on giving a talk abroad or to a particular group of people, and hand gestures may have a different meaning. And so it's just something to be mindful of. Next slide. Thank you. Or do I have control? Oh, thank you. The second topic that I wanted to briefly talk about is on building partnerships. I personally still have a lot to learn about the full diversity of people around the world and in our community. So even I don't know everything. We don't know everything about everybody. And so if you want to just learn more, like I do, I suggest reaching out to educational organizations and scientists, and particularly those whose goal is to serve diverse communities and become an ally and collaborate. It's a great way to increase your understanding of the audiences you wish to engage, to better prepare communication strategies. You know, these organizations may also help you by providing feedback, give you suggestions and additional resources. So if they can't help you, they can at least point you to the right group or the right person. And they can promote your presentations and activities to their networks. This is something that Geo Latinas does a lot on Twitter, is just amplify other people's work who are allies and are collaborating with our group. And so how to reach out, make connections. Again, social media, this is something that I've done heavily, or just through email. And I think the most important thing is to just be honest and clear of your intent and the goals. And then once you reach out to those groups, just listen and learn. And below are just a couple of examples of some organizations that you could reach out to. As I mentioned, I myself am one of the leaders of Geo Latinas, and I'm happy to be a contact. And like I said, if I can't help, I can at least point you to the right person. And of course, if you're planning to give a talk to a specific community, or in a specific, that includes a specific country, please include local community members in the planning and the presentation. And so if you're going to be giving a talk abroad, reach out to your host and just talk to them early, and work with them to make a talk that's appropriate for that audience. If you're giving an outreach talk, for example, to a Hispanic or Latinx serving high school, reach out to the teachers and work with them closely before your presentation. They know their students best. And so please include them in the planning as possible. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then related to this, of course, the best way to effectively communicate with a culturally diverse audience is just to include more diverse voices in the conversation. And this workshop is doing a great job with this by including a diverse group of people as part of the panel. And these are some things that you can also do personally. You can, oh, next slide. Sorry, thank you. And personally, this is something that you can do by including and creating a space for diverse voices in your team. So this includes students, but also collaborators. We all have different perspectives and life experience and learning styles, and bringing us all together brings in new perspectives that can help promote innovation and make more creative products. And so differences do make a difference. And so I do believe that our long-term plan should be just increasing and retaining more diverse planetary scientists and not trying to use quick fix solutions. And so I think just including more diverse voices in the discussion, I think, is ultimately the best way forward. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And David.
All right. Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yes, you are. We can hear you. Yay.
All right. So for you guys who don't know me, I'm David Trang. I'm an assistant researcher at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Just kind of give you a background and my relationship with Hawaii. I'm originally from Michigan, and I moved to Hawaii when I was 18 to study astronomy and geology at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. I'm originally Cambodian American, and if those who really know me knows it's a lot more complicated than that. So after I did my bachelor's in, while I was in Hilo, I also spent time learning Hawaiian, and then when I went to University of Hawaii at Manoa to get my PhD in planetary science, I continued being part of that culture. I spent some time learning Tahitian language as well, which is also part of Polynesia. In case you guys don't know, Hawaii and Tahiti, they're related. And then I also learned how to dance what we call ori. Ori is a type of Tahitian dancing. So hula is Hawaiian, ori is Tahitian. So by being part of these communities, it has helped me understand their perspective and their ways of looking at things, and the relationship between this indigenous groups of Polynesians and the science community and the interaction. So I kind of got that unique perspective by being here for so long. So I have next slide. It's not going. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk more about the 30-meter telescope and just kind of lessons learned. So next slide. So in case you guys don't know what the 30-meter telescope is and aren't familiar with what's going on with one of the biggest news in Hawaii, basically the astronomy community wants to build a 30-meter telescope on the summit of Mauna Kea. It's a very, very, very large telescope, but there's a lot of opposition to it. So this is kind of a picture that kind of represents this opposition. So Mauna Kea is a volcano and one of the mountains on Hawaii Island. If you want to be culturally sensitive, it's better to say Hawaii Island, not to say Big Island, because Hawaii is the name of the island. So anyway, so this is what you're seeing in this picture is the access road. So there's actually two-ish kind of roads, but one of them that can be used to construct the 30-meter telescope. And so you can see that everybody's kind of blocking the road, preventing construction from going up. So the opposition, the reason why they're against the construction of the 30-meter telescope actually ranges really widely. It ranges from environmental to cultural to political. So there's a huge spectrum of the reasons why they are protesting. So one of the reasons why this is important is because after listening to what a lot of people say on both sides, on the science side and the opposition side, and why they're for it, why they're against it, one of the things I've noticed in the science community, and that's consistently talked about, is that this is about science versus culture. Science versus Hawaiian culture or Polynesian culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later, and how we're going to learn that this thinking is actually incorrect. It's not actually what the actual issue is, and the science community needs to spend some time to actually sit down and listen and reflect. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So that's something that I think is really important, is that sitting and reflecting about what did we do as a science community? What did we not do right? And the reason why I'm talking about this is because since we're talking about how to talk to diverse groups, this case study is practically a gold mine to understand what we as scientists can do better, right? Because at the end of the day, nobody has done anything perfectly, right? Like, the opposition has, they have some things right and they have some things wrong. Same thing with the science community. We have some things right, we have some things wrong. And as someone who's part of the science community, and as I'm speaking to the science community, we can do something about this, what we do as a science community to improve ourselves, to do things better, right? So that's why I'm bringing this up, because this is all kind of gold. Next slide. So one of the big things I really want to attack is science missionaries, right? So we're all familiar with Christian missionaries, how they went around the world, and the idea was to convert people into Christianity, to get them into it, because in a way they're saving souls, right? So the intentions to them was really good, right? But the thing is, what's happening with what I've noticed with the 30-meter telescope is I'm kind of seeing something very similar, is that I'm seeing a different type of missionary, not a Christian missionary, but we're talking about science missionaries, right? So how you present your science to the public is very important, right? Because one of the things that I know for this, since we're all in the science is very important to us. We value it a lot. And we think it will solve a lot of problems and make the world better and so on and so on. But the thing is, we need to step back and ask and remember that culture matters too, because science is important, but culture is our humanity. It's who we are, right? So when we talk about in terms of Star Trek, Picard always talks about, we're explorers and scientists, but he also talks about, we are humans and there's a humanity to us. It's part of our identity, is who we are, and we need to remember that, culture matters too. And even though for these, for indigenous groups, they're not your culture, it's important to them, right? So even though it's not important to you, it's important to them, and we need to, be sensitive to what they value and what's important to them. So kind of know what your intentions are when you're out there spreading science and teaching science? Are you there because you're trying to tell them, hey, science is a tool, you can use it to understand, or you can create things with it, or you can use it to understand and explore your own identity and your own universe? Or are you going to go in with the intentions of, well, I'm spreading science to tell everyone this is truth. This is the way the world works. This is the way it is. Nothing that you say is sacred because science said so, right? If you say things like that, or something around it, I'm kind of giving you more of a harsher example, but if you say something around like science is truth and realistic and everything that our reality is, you're going to push these people away, right? Because it's kind of that missionary idea, is that you're going there and telling them this is what you should believe in because everything else you had before is incorrect. So be very mindful about how you answer why science is important, right? Because if you go on saying, hey, science is important because we save humanity, we're going to make the human race better, it's kind of has that white knight complex or savior complex, right? And nobody it's just kind of a turnoff, right? Like it just doesn't really jive with people. Like, hey, I'm here to save you. It's not a good way to come off, right? So be mindful about how you answer this question, right? Because one way to answer is maybe you can go on a personal level, right? You could, for example, for me, I study the moon. I've always been into the moon. So it's like being on Wikipedia. You keep hitting links and you keep studying it and you keep reading, right? So it's kind of like that with science. Is we got into something and we just continue to look into it further and further and further and further. So next slide. So one of the things I've really noticed with the whole TMT is that public outreach and education is all about scientists talking to the public, right? And that's really good. But let's look at it from this perspective. Let's say you have two friends, right? You have the science community and you have the indigenous community or some diverse group community, right? And what makes a good friendship, right? Is a good friendship the type of friendship where one side does all the talking and the other side does all the listening? I mean, hopefully we would all say that, no, this is not a really good friendship, right? A good friendship is where both sides talk to each other and listen to each other and spend time to get to know each other, right? So if we want to establish a good relationship with that community, us as scientists can't just sit there and be like, hey, we're just going to go out and do public outreach and talk to them about science, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, the other part of outreach and education is not to do that talking, but also to do the listening, right? Listening is very important because then they are being heard and you understand how they think, how they see the world, and you can adjust how you present your science and how you present your research in a way that helps them understand what you are doing. And it also builds a relationship where they are now more likely to trust you, right? Because if you just go in there and just tell them what to do, they're not going to trust you, right? But if you build that relationship, then you build a sense of trust, and now you're building this nice, strong relationship between two communities. So anyways, so one of the things that I think that I've seen is, and I'm going to give all my examples based on Hawaii, is that, one of the things that we really need to do is, go out and actually go to these events. For example, in this picture, this is from Mary Monarch. This is live all over the world. This is our Olympics of hula, and people could go out and actually watch. Sure, if you don't know anything now, just watch and listen and ask questions. Don't go in there with making assumptions and interpretations really quick. Just spend time active listening, learn. So be part of that community. If you want, just go out and actually learn hula, learn Hawaiian language. You don't have to be like super fluent, but know, some words, right? So even when you have students in teaching a class, it's important to be able to even pronounce their name, right? Because that is like the ultimate respect, is being able to pronounce names that are in a language that you're not familiar with. But the only thing that I have to say, and even though it's important to be out in the community and get to know it and learn about it, it's also important to watch out for cultural appropriation, right? So cultural appropriation is an entire subject. I could go on about 2 weeks about that. We're not going to go into that. but I'm just gonna put that warning there. Even though you're into it, also be mindful about how you are using the culture and the things you've learned. Are you using it in a respectful manner, or are you using it for your own benefit and you're not actually using it for what it was originally created in the first place? Next slide. So this is kind of my last slide. So one of the things is, I know, it takes a long time to learn about somebody else's culture and to get to know them and be part of it. So if it's something that's new to you and you have something that's coming up, find somebody who is well-versed, usually some type of educational leader, right? A school or something like that. And teach them what you want to teach, and let that person who's already well-versed in the community, really well-versed in the culture and language, and let them lead the way. It's better to let them lead the way, because it's easier for students to associate somebody who gets them, right? It's kind of like how we have a lot of like foreign exchange students, and what happens when foreign exchange students are, at a certain school, they tend to get together with people from the same country, right? Because there's that relationship part of it. There's an understanding. So let somebody else take the lead if you're talking to a different group, an indigenous group or a diverse group, if you're not as comfortable or familiar with it, right? And one of the examples for this, and I think a big example for why this is important, is in Hawaii, for example, we have, from what I remember about 10 years ago, is that there's a shortage of counseling psychologists, right? And one of the things that happened was they were bringing a lot of counseling psychologists from the mainland. But the issue with that was that these counselors were not really able to relate to the locals and the Hawaiians as well, because of that disconnect in culture, right? So there's speaking the same language, but there's also speaking the same culture, and that's very, very important. So I think I hit my third point, but the last part to just remember is, when you start to learn a culture, there's no such thing as everything, right? Like, I have a friend from Tahiti, he's Tahitian, and he's a cultural anthropologist, and we talk about this a lot, about culture and how to help with the Hawaiian Tahitian community. And one thing he always tells me is that, I'm Tahitian, I spent all my time doing this, but I still know nothing, I still don't know everything about Tahitian culture. And that's the thing that we need to remind ourselves, is that we don't know everything about any culture, right? So like, when people go out to other countries, for example, Peace Corps, and if I remember, there's this, I think, a study that said, if you do Peace Corps for a few years, it's not as effective as somebody who spent their lifetime there, right? So it's the same idea here. If you want to help, present to a culture or an indigenous group or a diverse or a certain ethnic group, it's important that you don't just spend, if you're going to do this for a little bit, or you're going to do this with a group, it should be done for, recognize that you're going to be doing it for a lifetime. And that's how, and the longer you do it, the more effective you are. And I think that's all I had. So next slide.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Now, before we move on to the questions that I have here, we've already got a couple questions. The first one I'm going to ask Francis to address, and that is, do you know of any websites that will identify idioms on slides or in writing? How can we, and the answer can be you don't know, but do you, or does anyone else know of any particular places where we can identify idioms? And we need to make sure you're unmuted. So let me try unmuting
Francis
you.
became muted again. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, you're unmuted. You're unmuted, Francis.
Yeah, I keep muting myself because I laugh a lot. I smile, and I'm even when I'm quiet, I make a lot of noises. So I keep muting myself. I was actually looking that up right before this. I don't know anything on the top of my head, but I'm happy to sort of curate that and share that and include that on the list of things that have already been grouped together.
And if other people have suggestions, please feel free to enter them. Chrissy, David, do either of you have any ideas where we might be able, how can we help to identify idioms that we're not even aware that we're using?
Oh man, poetic sayings. I think that's a hard one to answer. I guess it's I mean, we're all scientists, so we're all really good at being literal in our papers, right? So the question is, you know, would you say what you just said in the paper?
That's a good one.
Yeah, I use "that's the kicker" a lot, and I used to think everybody knew what "that's the kicker" is, and then I realized it's a very colloquial term for the Appalachia and the Midwest, and people are like, "Wait, what? What is the kicker?" So just, you know, I like David's thought on this of, if you don't add it into a paper and it's not something you would genuinely try to write down, it's something you should be tossing on at the end of the sentence.
Good point.
Yeah. And I will say I even struggled myself when I was thinking about what to say during my slides. Even I was including accidentally idioms that I've learned, because they're so ingrained, especially in American English, that you don't even realize you're doing it unless you're very conscious of it. And I guess I challenge anybody in the next day or two to just be mindful of how you speak, and you're going to be quite surprised as to how quite frequently we all use idioms. And I think what David said is a good suggestion. Is like, if you wouldn't include it in a paper, you probably shouldn't include it.
Or you can find out more from the audience themselves what their understanding of what you said was. Feedback is awesome, great, right? I can remember when my son was little and I said I was going to jump in the shower. He's, "Mommy, don't do that. You could hurt yourself." Well, jump in the shower is an idiom. So anyway.
Yeah.
I have one recommendation though for the science community, because I think that we have this major problem where we all speak in acronyms nonstop too. Particularly those who are on certain missions. Your acronyms do not always mean the same instrument on a different mission. So perhaps learning what the acronym actually means and calling maybe your instrument by more than just, you know, Europa UVES, instead of saying EUVES or something like that, it can get quite confusing. So we as a community need to do better, even speaking within the community and trying to be accessible across just slightly different disciplines on this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was going to say that also for idioms, I would also be mindful of that when talking to people individually. It's even happened to me where I was talking to somebody about my car being a lemon, and he was Polish and he had no idea what I was talking about, right? But I immediately knew, like, from the look of his face, I had no idea what I was talking about. And so just something to be mindful about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was a question also for David. So if you're dealing with two cultures simultaneously, or there's, you know, one audience isn't monolithic. Any audience so there in Hawaii, you might be having some Polynesians as well as some Japanese or Native American or two indigenous groups. How do you build a relationship when there's more than when the community that you're dealing with isn't monolithic?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I guess that one's a little bit harder to answer since I'm mostly, well, for Hawaii, I think the kind of locals and Hawaiians, it's not monolithic. I mean, it kind of spans like kind of a range, but for at least for us, you know, it's a little bit easier for kind of the locals and Hawaiians just because they kind of have a shared history of the plantation days. But and it's true, Hawaii is very diverse. You know, we have people from Japan and China and Korea, a lot of, as well as even Native Americans are here. And that's a good question. I haven't thought about that too much. And maybe it's one of those things where it might be important to, you know people that may be able to reach out and talk to these people as well, and try to get them as well. But otherwise, it's one of those things. I guess for me, I'm more focused on my experiences is helping more the indigenous community, since they're a little bit since they don't have as much representation in the science community compared to other ethnic groups. So sorry, I kind of give you a non-answer.
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess, you know, you prioritize building a relationship with one community and then try to expand on it. Does anyone have any other ideas? Either Chrissy or Frances or anyone online want to share any other additional ideas when you're faced with, for instance, 2 Indigenous groups at the same time? And we're going to move on. Okay.
I feel like it's such a complicated, topic.
It
We'll
is.
probably spend weeks, talking about this. But ultimately, I feel that, not only do we need to be talking to each of those communities, but those communities need to talk to each other ultimately as well, right? And so I think that it's a very complex topic, I think, for the amount of time that we probably have.
I will say one of the places where I saw this as an excellent example was SOCNAS this year, which was held in Honolulu, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanas and Native Americans in STEM conference, which is the National Diversity in STEM conference. Eddie Rivera was actually there. Eddie, do you have anything? I know you're muted, but I bet we can magically make you get unmuted. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you saw that conference really including both of these, several unique cultural groups in one science conference.
Ed, I think you're unmuted unless everything moved.
Testing.
I was having to. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yay. Okay. I really like SACNAS things this year in that they incorporated into many sessions, many of even just the lunch times. They included aspects of Hawaiian culture. One of the sessions I was at, we had a prayer session that was led by a local group, and it was nice in order to see that culture being represented when you are literally within their home, and getting to learn a lot about their point of view and where they were coming from. I was also at several sessions on about Mauna Kea, and I liked from the presenter point of view, and this is something that we talk about doing at our own conferences, is ensuring that you don't always allow the first person to the microphone to talk. You make sure that you are actually allowing others a voice. And so the session chairs at these at the sessions I was at did a really good job of making sure, okay, we've heard your perspective, we heard this type of culture perspective, let's make sure that these people are also talking and being heard. Those were two of the things I really liked about the conference.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and in the chat box, those of you who are trying to catch more about SACNAS, it's there, and the website's there, and they're in Long Beach this year, yeah, or San Diego, one or the other. Southern California.
Long Beach.
Long Beach, okay. Somebody's in San Diego this year. Too many conferences. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about partnerships. So things like, and these are open questions for any of our presenters. Others are welcome to jump in as well. In terms of partnerships, how have you chosen partners to approach? How have you initiated those partnerships? Because sometimes that's a little difficult. And then how can we ensure that the partnerships that we have with different groups are authentic, where it's give and take? We're not just reaching out to people because we want their help in reaching into their community, but it's an authentic partnership that really benefits everyone, where we're sharing some of our goals. And anyway, anyone wants to jump in, go right ahead. Who wants to go first? You can pick one question or all of them. I'm going to pick on Chrissy. Chrissy.
But Frances was about to speak.
I'm sorry.
Frances, do you want to go first? Because I did see you start to talk.
No, I was gonna ask at what level. I guess not necessarily at, reaching out to a different community, but like Ed and I, for example, we had started our partnership through social media and realizing, oh, we're both planetary scientists who are Puerto Rican and didn't have an organization to be able to reach our own community, right? And so I guess it depends on the level that you're talking about, but that's a very good example of like how I met Ed. And even Geo-Latinas wasn't a thing a year ago. And it was the same very organic thing where we also all somehow found each other through social media and identifying our needs. And so I guess when finding any partners to approach, it's like, what are your needs? Do you have similar needs to then be able to, I guess, progress, or else there's nothing that you have in common, right? And again, if it's a give or take, you need to have a common goal. And so that's I guess, yeah.
Awesome. Great points. Great points.
For me, it's been about broadening outside of my normal, what you would see as the normal outlet groups that I would be reaching out to. So, you know, when I first started doing workplace climate research and helping and understanding whether or not we had healthy, safe workplace climates for people, I was very much in the astrophysics community, with somewhat in the planetary science community, and I extended that to the planetary science community and got these huge results afterwards. But one of the big things for me is, as different groups who are not necessarily ones that I would typically be networking with reached out to me, I would work to become a resource for them, while at the same time trying to learn from them and provide them resources that were what they needed and wanted at that time. Not necessarily me. Not everybody wants a white woman standing up in front of them giving them a talk on bias, right? Sometimes it's about me learning in the same moment. So, you know, I went to a conference in Mexico last year. It's basically the equivalent to the American Physical Society for Mexico, and gave a talk on what we've done in terms of workplace climate. And the only reason why I went down to give the talk was so that I could meet up with their groups and talk about how to develop these surveys within the entire country of Mexico, which was this really great, fantastic moment. And I got to meet something like 15% of the female physicists in Mexico in this one conference period. And it was one of the most tremendous moments for me. So, you know, it was about providing them the resources, though. So I think when you're talking about partnerships, it's like, what can you give? It's not just what you can get out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. David, do you have anything to add to that?
I totally like how you ended that with Chrissy. It's
Yep.
It's not always about, you know, giving and trying to get them to learn and be into science and so on. It's also, what can we give? You know, what can we give them? And obviously we think that by giving them science, we're giving them something, but isn't it, you know, but you know, that's not what they value. You know, they value other things, and we need to know what they value, and we need to look at how we can help improve the things that they value, right? So in Hawaii, one of the things that I've been trying to work on, and would kind of answer these questions is, so I've been working with the University of Hawaii at Hilo, working with my kumu. Kumu means teacher. She's the one who taught me Hawaiian language. And we are trying, basically one of the things that we want to do is that we're trying, so one of the problems with Hawaii is a lot of the names that if you ever visited Hawaii, a lot of the names for places are, a lot of it is colonial names, right? Everything from Hawaii Kai is a colonial name, but even Kaka'ako, right, which is one of the areas next to Waikiki, that actually doesn't really have a meaning, right? It actually had an old name to it. It sounds Hawaiian, and it sounds like, oh, this probably was the original name, but there's actually an old name to it. So one of the things is, because you know, I have a mapping background, I have a planetary science background, you know, remote sensing background, you know, I have these skill sets that I could provide to the community by helping them bring back these names, a way to restore these names and teach people, like, what do they mean? What was the original name? How to learn how to even say it. Even, you don't have to be a Hawaiian speaker, but it's a way to teach people how to say these things, right? Because even places like on Hawaii Island, there's this place called Bay, right? But its true name is Anaiho Omalu Bay, right? So it's basically, we as scientists have a large, huge range of skills. And those skills can actually be applied to things that could help with, you know, little things to these diverse groups or indigenous groups, that on things that they value. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to do, but unfortunately time is, one only has so much time in their life, right? So that's where I go into the whole partnership, and it goes back to what Chrissy said. It's what can you give them, and by giving them, you're building that relationship. And when they know what the skills you have, they see the usefulness of those skills, and they will want to go into it and learn more about it, right? Because they see the usefulness of it and how it helps their community.
There's a really powerful word that David has just used like 3 times that I want to make sure that we really emphasize here, which is values. I think that we as scientists are trained to think only about data and about presenting our science as the way. This is the way. All of us with our helmets on right now. But it's not actually that. You bring your values with you to each time you present, each time you do science, and I actually do a proposal writing workshop for both general audiences plus for the science community. And I've noticed that whenever I'm working with a really diverse group of individuals, when they talk about their values as a person and as a scientist, they are the same. When it is a non-diverse group, when it's typically white, male, older individuals that I'm doing the proposal writing workshop with, the values are very different. So I think one of the big things that we as scientists can learn is how to bring our values into our science on a daily basis, and how to use things like respect and empathy within our everyday work. I think that will make those partnerships go so much better.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to advance it. I'm trying to go backwards. There we go. Let's, and others agree as well. Yay. So let's move on. We can come back to partnerships, but let's talk a little bit about biases, the biases that, and I think we have a pretty good definition of biases, but if anyone would like a little bit of a background on some of the different biases that we're thinking of, please go ahead and mention that now. And some of this, a fair amount of this was covered in Chrissy's talk earlier. How can we determine our own biases when we're partnering with a particular audience, when we're working with a particular audience, trying to mutually meet needs together? And how can we mitigate for those biases in our efforts to communicate with and engage particular audiences? And then this recognition that our audiences may have biases against us that we might need to mitigate for as well. So anyone who wants to go first this time?
I've already talked a lot on this topic, so. What I will say about this is that it's super important to analyze your own biases every now and then. I became the chair on the Committee on the Status of Women in Astronomy like 6 years ago. I shouldn't think about time and how it's going by. But when I did that, I took the implicit bias test for the first time. And I sobbed my eyes out for a good hour straight and debated resigning immediately from the position. I was like, I am the most biased human being on this planet. I should not be in this job. We all have biases. It's about understanding and recognizing your own biases and working little by little to chip away at them. So things like asking preferred pronouns before the start of a conversation, or sticking things like your Twitter handle on the front. You can keep continuing to engage a conversation afterwards. Those little tiny things are things that I've built up over the years of mucking them up and trying to constantly improve myself. So one of the big things that I do before I engage an audience is I write down 3 things that I absolutely want to relay in that topic, in that conversation, in that presentation that is occurring. And I make sure I hit those. Beyond that, a lot of it's about me listening, engaging the audience at the same time, which is really, really difficult to do. And the whole how do we manage or mitigate biases that go both ways? I have been on a stage with an audience that wanted nothing to do with me, and I can tell you how extremely difficult it is. Sometimes when you're standing up for what's right, you've got to just stand up and let them throw stuff at you, right? and hold your ground. And then other times, you need to be able to sit down and listen. It's about knowing those two moments. It's not easy. That's what I can say.
Thank
But
you.
we can all learn. I think the thing that everybody has said on repeat today is that we don't know everything and we all need to learn more. So really learn about your own biases and find ways to mitigate them.
Awesome. Awesome. Francis, David, do either of you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I'll let Francis go first. Sure. I guess one of the things that I do myself is if I'm talking to a group of people, or if I meet somebody new and I start getting negative thoughts, I start thinking, why am I having negative feelings right now? And, is it truly because this person, is it something that this person is saying, or am I having some sort of bias that I didn't realize I had? And I think with everything is just being mindful of new interactions with other people, new environments. I've had to deal a lot with this being at Dartmouth, which is a very privileged place. And I have my own biases that I didn't realize I had against a lot of privileged people. And I think recognizing again that we just all have it and just being mindful of that is probably the best thing. And just being honest about it. And as Chrissy said, just sort of chipping away at that, it's like, what's causing the bias and what can you do about it? And I think talking to other people, engaging with diverse people, right, is a good way to sort of mitigate some of those biases.
Right, and I want to add to that, and I think that's important, and it goes back to like the whole active listening, right? It's important to listen and ask questions. So if you're going to be engaging a certain group, it's always, if you have a friend in there, you could ask them, some of the pet peeves that they notice that come up, things like that. But it's about wanting to learn and active listening and actually asking questions, rather than sitting there making assumptions. Oh, I know everything, or actually ask questions. Ask specific questions. And there's no such thing as something that's dumb, because you'd rather have somebody call you out, have a friend call you out on a personal level, than have an entire group call you out, right? Or the fact that you're trying to talk to your group and then now your communication is no longer effective, right? Because the bigger picture is communication, right, to that larger audience. So it's better to have, it's kind of like how we have this, when we pretend we have when we're taking a test, we pretend that it's good to get all your questions wrong in the homework, because maybe the rest of it will be right in the test. It's kind of similar idea right there, right? Make sure you iron out everything that you all those assumptions that you may have had, or anything like that. And I've seen that in Hawaii a little bit, and it is a huge pet peeve for me. And I'll give you an example. I remember one of my friends, we were having this kind of meeting with graduate students, and one of my friends who's Hawaiian, and she's like, oh, I haven't been to the beach in years. And everyone's just like, and it's just like, it's just kind of like, this is, everyone's kind of imposing that whole all Hawaiians are always out on the beaches and they all can surf and blah, blah, blah. And these are things that, I'm not they're probably propagated through some type of media, right? Whether it's TV or movies or whatever. But it's one of those things that, when you walk into, you got to remove all those assumptions, and actually question them. And the best way to do that is have friends that be open-minded, just tell them straight up, be like, hey, call me out, I'd rather have you call me out than, me trying to figure it out. Because to be honest, it's one of those things it's hard to figure these things out by yourself, right? Because you need people around you that will call you out. So, tell them specifically, hey, call me out on these things, obviously in a nice way, and be open-minded about it.
Awesome. Awesome.
And biases can occur from different levels as well. It can be, just based on someone's name. You can just immediately have a bias just based on reading someone's name. It's even happened to me. I've been misgendered. I didn't, things like that. Depends on the country, but I'm misgendered all the time. People see my name and they automatically assume that I'm not I don't speak English, right? Or my English is less than theirs, right? So there's different levels to the point of like how I look and people already having a bias. One that happens a lot to me is people assuming that I think I look very young for my age. And so there's a lot of assumptions as well about my, you know, level of where I am. And it happens a lot at conferences where I'm walking around with my husband, who's a white man, and people think I'm his undergrad, right? And so I think there's different levels of biases that can happen. I know, I'm aging very well. But I think it's really important to just be mindful that I think we all do it. It happens all the time, and it probably happens to your friends. And I think, you know, starting the conversation and just being honest about, you know, other people's biases, your own biases, and having a platform like this, I think is a good step forward. Yeah.
So I want to add, based on what you just said, Frances, so if you are about to go give a presentation, let's say for a group of high school students, because, you know, they're going to have their own thoughts, and if you're giving a presentation for a group of high school students, are there any things that you do to either establish your credentials or your professional level, or to try to connect with them, because you know that when you go in, they're going to have biases against you based on your appearance, your age,
Oh, yeah.
your gender, your all different things. And what sorts of things might you do to help just proactively mitigate some of the biases that you anticipate you might be dealing with from different audiences?
Oh, that's a difficult one, and it depends on the audience.
It does.
And
So
I feel
assume
like,
high school students.
yeah, and I feel like almost anything that I do can always be like, I don't know. My PhD advisor just told me just to be comfortable, and I think that's probably the first thing. Is just be comfortable in your own skin. You know who you are, and that's probably the best advice. And that's sort of what I've taken from day to day. I used to dress differently. I would sort of dress up when I would give presentations, and when I'm talking to a group of high school students, I would dress up. You know, I would tell them to refer to me by a certain title, and I usually helped distinguish, you know, or I would talk about my own experiences and what I'm doing with my work, and then I made it very, very clear about my knowledge. But I don't know, these days I just try to be comfortable in my own skin and
Be authentically who you
yeah,
are.
yes. But I feel that everybody is different, and I think everybody should just do what feels comfortable to them. But those are some of the things that I've done in the past, and yeah.
Yeah, for me, it hasn't been high school students who are disrespectful at me due to my age, to be frank, to be honest. Yeah. No, I suspected the answer was no. It's not high school students that are usually the ones where you're having to worry about that bias being amplified. When I I worked at NASA headquarters before I was at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I started at NASA headquarters at the age of 29. And so I was younger than most of my colleagues, significantly younger than most of my colleagues. And the biases that were built in, that I was just too young to know anything about the world, or too blonde, even though I wasn't blonde. I was naive. Those sorts of assumptions about me weren't coming from people who were my age or younger. So I think that the people that a lot of times younger, particularly female scientists, have to try to modify their appearance and be very assertive about their expertise with our older male colleagues. And that's disappointing. Because again, I think that if we all stepped in with a level of respect and empathy right from the beginning, we could talk about what good things everybody has and not how we're trying to amplify ourselves. I typically have really bright hair, like purple or blue, but the pandemic is impacting that right now. So that's why I have no hair. But, you know, I don't want to change that just because it makes somebody look at me and see less, because it has become who I am, and I'm super proud of who I am, and I shouldn't have to change that to make my fellow manager colleagues or anybody have more respect for me. they need to step up, not me in those moments. I'm hoping Francis hears that too. Like, yeah.
I absolutely understand that. Back when I was in grad school, I did have trouble in terms of my undergrad students in the labs that I taught. When you stick 300 students in a dark planetarium and put somebody in charge of them who's only a couple of years older, I had a few issues that I had to learn how to address. But David, do you have anything that you'd like to add to any of this?
I don't think I really do on this one.
Or anecdotes. You can always
What's that?
or anecdotes. I don't know. I feel that people are so uncomfortable about talking about biases because it is a very difficult topic.
Yeah. It really is. I'll admit that's not it's not one of those topics that I think about the most, since there's so many issues. You only have time to think about a handful of them before
Absolutely.
you can get to the other ones. Yeah.
So let's go on to some other ones then. So making our science communication inclusive. And I had a brief discussion with some of the folks at LPI. Kenda, should we limit this to inclusion? Let's start off with inclusion. We recognize that there's all sorts of issues here. Kenda pointed out that as an African-American, people, when she's at a science meeting, assume that she's part of the staff, the hotel staff, just because she is African-American. Kenda, there's not really much you can do about that. Do you want to add, is there anything that you do to address that when you are participating as a professional at a meeting so that people recognize that you're a professional? Is there anything you do? And I'm going to find you and unmute you. Hold on. Let me find you and unmute you. You're unmuted.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Yeah, that's a challenging one because on the one hand, you have to manage their embarrassment once you let them know that you're actually a member of the conference. And on the other hand, it's the trick of making sure that you're not seen as that right away. I've tried everything, in addition to, dressing up very well, making sure that I'm sometimes more dressed up than my fellow conference goers. But then again, that can still make you then think that you're part of the hotel or the conference center. I think, basically just trying to, wearing my conference tag, like my tag that shows who I am very clearly at all times, making sure that I try to ask at least one question during a talk if it's a session that I'm not giving my talk in. And then the other way I mitigate that is definitely give a talk so people know that I'm part of the meeting or their conference. But it's not an easy thing. The biggest thing where it becomes a problem is, again, once somebody, trying to be polite, trying to be cool on calling somebody out on their mistake and their clear bias, and then trying to, help them manage their embarrassment is the biggest trick.
Very good points.
Can I ask Kenda a follow-on question?
Please do.
How can we help when those moments happen? How can your other conference goers who are near you and may encounter this, what can they be doing? I think bystander training is extremely important here.
Mm-hmm. Probably the easiest thing to do is, because the next thing that they assume is I'm a grad student, so it's just, hey, Dr. Lynch, how are you doing? Or something like that. Just kind of acknowledging that I'm a member of the community, or anybody else who's encountering that they're a member of the community. And I think it's less important. I wouldn't say it's less important. I'm pretty tenacious, and I've finally got a card-carrying member, so I can handle myself now. But as a grad student, as a postdoc, was where it was a little bit more challenging. So helping our graduate students and our postdocs of diversity, when that happens to them, is really crucial. Like really kind of helping them, making sure that whoever is making that mistake understands that this is a member of the community, and kind of being a bystander and helping and intervening in that case, especially for our early career people, I think is really important, if that makes sense.
And related to all of that, Kenda, so the flip side, taking this issue, which, of biases and assumptions, and then if you are working with an audience, if you're working with kids or at a school or something, is there anything that you have to do to mitigate that in terms of establishing your credentials that you are a scientist?
All I have to do is show them a picture of me with a rover, and then they believe me. I show them a picture of me with Curiosity or something like that, and they're like, "Oh, wow!"
Okay.
They're like, "No, you're not really a scientist." And I'm like, "Yeah, I am. Here, look at this." Or a picture of me in the shuttle trainer. Or I just show them a cool picture of me doing something sciencey, and then they believe me.
Okay. So
I got one question. So when these people feel like embarrassed, isn't that kind of a good thing? It's like a kid who touches the hot stove, and they're like, they kind of learn, hey, I'm not gonna do that again, and they actually like learn from it, right? Like, isn't that, rather than managing their embarrassment, be like,
it is, but that whole thing of sometimes when you back a wounded animal into the corner,
oh yeah.
So most of the time they're very apologetic, but not always.
there's a couple of comments that are related to this issue, and then I want to spend a little bit of time moving on to this last discussion topic. But so Julie mentioned that, sometimes she was mistaken for a secretary, but her colleague did correct them. It was embarrassing. Julie, if you feel like adding anything to that, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, but you don't have to stay unmuted. You can mute yourself if you want.
Just making sure you guys can hear me. I'm on my phone, so it's a little bit.
We can hear you just fine.
I was just going to say, just in the idea of intervention, like bystander intervention training, it was super helpful that like my male boss was the one who kind of took the heat for it and sort of stood up and was like, no, she's the one giving the presentation. Thanks. Have a great day.
Yeah.
As opposed to like putting that on me to make the correction. So just to point out, like that kind of training definitely helps. I went to that this year when it was offered at JSC. I picked up a lot of really great tips for how I can be a better ally to other people who are facing that around me. But yeah, it was also one of those, like, at times I was running a whole conference and people would still come up to me and be like, can I get a drink refill? And I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to do it. And like, I would just like leave the room and come back with their drink. And then in the next moment I would be giving a plenary and they're like, oh, and it would just sort of hit them what they had done. And I'm like, you know what, you're gonna learn. Cool. But it is that same moment where like I totally get it. Sometimes you don't even want to correct people because you don't know what they're like. Sure, they could take it really well and be like, oh, my bad. But other times they're, they might come back at you being really aggressive about it. So occasionally it's just like, this is not worth it to correct if I'm just gonna, nope.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's a comment about the whole issue with asserting that you are a doctor. And the point here was made, sometimes the media doesn't necessarily recognize your credentials as a doctor. But in addition to the media, I think that might also be a problem with some audiences. So again, this biases. Baravi, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to talk about this. You also pointed out that this is amplified for women and women of color in particular. Anything that you'd like to add there?
Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm talking to my phone is up. But no, I think it was just a general comment and observation that I'd made, and given that this is sort of being discussed this openly in this sort of forum, I felt that is another avenue that I feel needs to be addressed in some way or at some point, because often media will always come to us, when there's an astronomy or planetary news moment, and in that same instance, they're not necessarily giving you the acknowledgement of those credentials. And so I'm new to the whole talking to media aspect of things, but it can't be missed. And I'm curious to know what others are doing, thinking, or have what sort of approach have you taken?
I think it's not just media. I've noticed I have to watch myself. I tend to be in emails more likely to be familiar with female scientists and use their first name, and more likely to be formal with male scientists and address them by doctor and their last name. And that's something I'm working on, trying to be equitable in how I address people. Do others have comments or thoughts on this? That we want to ensure that we are treating each other well and recognizing the expertise of the other people professionally and politely, and how can we encourage audiences to do the same?
It goes back to respect. You know, a big component of this for me, I was actually part of a news article several years ago where I was very clear about what my credentials were. My signature line said Dr. Christina Richey, and then it gave all my credentials afterwards. And the article came out, and all of the men who were quoted in the article were Dr. blah, 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 and then Christina, blah, 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 blah. And our media people actually contacted the journalist and basically told them that that can never happen again. So for me, I was fortunate in that I had the right people to be able to be bystanders for me. But it comes back to respect. I mean, if somebody asks you to call them doctor if they have the credentials. I'm not saying this is like Doc Adler on The Tiger King. He has no actual PhD or medical degree. I'm not quite sure why he gets to use it and I wouldn't. Let's put it that way.
Any final thoughts on this before we finish up with this? We've got 10 minutes left. So
it happens to me all the time, and people just insist on calling me Miss or Mrs. even without knowing any information about me. Yes, I don't know if there's a good answer apart from like everybody said, I just try to be honest about my credentials, give that information first and at the end. And yeah, I don't know if there's a good answer apart from, like, if you're telling people and they just don't listen, I don't know. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yes.
as Padma said, some people don't learn for the long term,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but okay. So inclusion and science communication. Do any of you have some recommendations to ensure that our messages to different audiences are inclusive? Let's start with just that one. There's 3 here, but they're very different topics. So.
I think just going back to one of my slides, I think the best way to ensure that your message is inclusive is by having a team that's diverse. If you have diverse voices contributing to a message, I think it's probably the best way to ensure that inclusive as possible. But that's just my own personal opinion.
No, I totally agree with that. And I, I have this kind of similar thing on my slide is depending on your audience, maybe it's better to let somebody else lead the way. Everybody on your team is probably capable of doing the exact same thing. They just obviously need a little bit more training or whatever, and because we got to remember what the bigger picture is. The bigger picture is to communicate, right? The bigger picture isn't who's the leader. It's not about egos. It's about having that, I think it's just bigger picture. Remember what is the objective, and keep your eye on that.
Chrissy, do you have anything to add? And I see Padma has added something, so I'm going to unmute her as well.
Go ahead, Padma. I feel like I'm going to have a lot to say on those last 2.
Okay.
All I said was I basically try to do inclusivity by playing the role that I like to see promoted. Example, in the last few observing campaigns that I have done, I don't see very many female PIs. So I was the PI. I promoted the project. I hand-selected the team, and I made sure that the tasks they were given, they did, even though I was always keeping an eye in case they slacked off and I had to finish it. But the role was that hey, I'm the I'm the PI. You have to listen to me. I do know what I'm talking about. However, you're all selected for a certain role you're going to do. And there was a lot of resistance the first time I did it because I was crossing the boundary between personal relationships and friendships to becoming a professional with everybody. And the second time I did it, everybody kind of said, okay, this is what Padma wants to get done. And the third time we're trying to do it now, but with the coronavirus situation, we may not be able to do it, but we still follow the lead that I set for them, saying, hey, every week we have a telecon. This is the time you're going to meet, and this is the agenda. And the night before, no matter what time it is, I always send an agenda so they see that I stick to my word. And regardless of the time I put in, they also are expected to put in the same amount of time. So I think that's the role. That's how I provide inclusivity, and everybody is touted. I mean, I try to promote everybody by good feeling, by seeing something good in what they have done, and then gently tell them afterwards that, hey, you know, we could have done this, or we could have done this a little better. But always find something unique that they have done in their role that you would probably not have thought about. And that is how I include my members.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Let's move on to intent versus impact. How do you relate to audiences who are different from yourself when it comes to thinking about that intent versus impact? Chrissy, you mentioned you thought you have a lot to talk about. Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. This is one of those things where I think that a lot of people, when they're engaging in difficult conversations or they're going into an audience that it doesn't necessarily represent them, they tend to forget that it's not about you in that moment. It's about how you're relaying the greater good to everyone. And so you have to remember that when you put information out there, it's not about your intent of doing good. It's about how that information is received. And if it's received negatively, how can you modify it such that it actually conveys the message you meant? It goes back to respect, right? And so I think that a lot of folks, especially when they're engaging in difficult conversations, these two questions kind of go hand in hand. But when you're engaging in difficult conversations, you can get very defensive very easily, right? Especially if there's any feelings involved in this, any sort of emotion. And I think one of the things that I always want to make sure that community members are doing when we have these conversations is they take a step back and they say, how am I impacting the other person here? How are the words that I'm saying getting relayed to them? How are they reacting? If it's negative, I'm relaying my words wrong, right? That wasn't the impact that I was expecting. If you're not getting the impact you expected, perhaps it's because you're not conveying your information the way you want to. It's not about whether or not you meant to be helpful or you meant to be nice. It's not about that. It's about how the impact is there. Just like when you're writing a proposal and you don't win and you get back that review panel evaluation and it says the proposal lacks this, this, and this. It's not about what you meant to say. It's about what was in the document at that moment. So think about it that way when we're talking about intent versus impact and relaying your communication, relaying your message to an audience. Practice on an audience beforehand. Definitely practice with somebody other than yourself and other than, say, the one person you live with.
Yeah. That's part of that whole partnership that we started with, right? That Frances was talking about. If you are practicing and preparing and planning what you are saying with members of the audience, and David, you had pointed out yesterday to me, it's not a matter of picking like one person to be the representative of that audience, because you can't do that either. David, do you have anything to add to any of this?
I think I'm more ready to answer the third question.
Okay, please go ahead for the third question, and then we'll come to Frances next.
I think creating a safe space for a difficult conversation, it kind of, it goes a little bit back to what Chrissy was saying is, it's so easy to get defensive, and it's so easy to speak what you have to say. But it's one of those things that we all have to remember, that listening is the most important skill. And even though it sounds easy, because a lot of us have done it since we were born, or even before we were born, but it's actually really hard in reality, right? Listening is actually a really hard skill. And just by letting someone talk and listening actually does create a safe space, because, and when I say active listening, I'm not, active listening doesn't mean you just sit there and you're just kind of like, sitting still or standing still, but it's all into the body language, as well as asking questions and trying to understand something, right? It's more important to understand what somebody else is saying and understand their difficult conversation that they're having, and understand where they're coming from before jumping into making your own interpretations and assumptions and so on. Just active listening is the most important skill, and thankfully active listening goes back to compassion and empathy, right? Those things are all related. So just by being an active listener, you are already a safe space.
Thank you. Thank you. Frances, I'm going to give you the final word. We're down to the last minute and a half.
Oh boy. I think David actually talked a lot. He made a lot of good points in his earlier presentation. And I think joining forces, when in doubt, I think it's always better to have a team. Again, make sure that you have a diverse group, but also always ask questions. If you don't have enough resources, try to find resources. And you also have to evaluate, when you're not the best person to be giving the message, right? Or doing the presentation. And I think having that self-awareness that, as David mentioned, I think probably like 20 minutes ago, that if you're not the best person, you should, it's all about the objective. Like, what are you trying to communicate? And if you're not the best person to communicate that, make space for the right person. But I think listening and being aware that you might need to find more resources, to me, is really important. And because we don't know everything about everybody. And I think we all I personally have a lot to learn. And so, yeah.
We absolutely all do have a lot to learn from each other. And I am very grateful to all of you for sharing. Whoops. I turned off microphones, I turned on microphones, unmuted people, so that if anybody would like to add their own comments, they can. I'm going to, that's a little noisy. Let me change this. I'm going to mute all, but you now all should have the ability to unmute yourselves. So anybody who wants to add comments or questions at this point, we are in the last few seconds. If you want to say thank you, if you want to speak to our presenters, now is a great time. Unmute yourself and say thank you, because I know I appreciate them and I'm sure you do as well. Thank you all so much for your time and for your help, and we look forward to hearing from you again.